to-do lists? Anybody else ever make a to-do list and decide that's just way too much and so you go do something else? Yeah, those are the moments when we're completely overwhelmed by our to-do lists. The class that's looking at the time is now, last class is this Wednesday by the way, made a list of all the things that need to be addressed in our world. Not just in our lives, but in the world. And all of the problems, everything from hunger to homelessness to racism to global warming. And by the time we finished, we had a whole whiteboard full of things. And I asked the group how they felt. What do you think they said? Overwhelmed. And that's part of our problem, isn't it? We look at all the things to do in our lives, all the things we're asked to do at church, all the things we're asked to do in all of the service clubs to which we belong, all of the problems in the world, and decide to sit down and watch TV because we're completely overwhelmed. We think we could try to get started, but where? And how? What would we do? When? And besides, do we even have the talent to get started at something? And what if we tried to do something and completely failed? We'd be disappointing God, we'd be disappointing ourselves, we'd be disappointing the people that we were trying to help. We'd just completely fail. And so rather than start, because we are pretty sure and pretty afraid we're going to fail, we just don't. We do something else entirely. Well, Haggai was talking to a lot of people who were completely overwhelmed. Haggai is writing 60 years after the Babylonian army came in and destroyed the city of Jerusalem, took it right down to stubble, to rubble. And then following that, completely destroyed Solomon's temple, took that completely down to rubble. They took away all the stuff that was valuable in Solomon's temple, the gold, the silver, the jewels, anything that was fit to carry. And they took that stuff along with the wealthy, the educated, and royalty off to captivity in Babylon. Now that left a lot of people still in the land who were left to wonder, what do we do now? Well, what they did was go live in the homes of the people that had abandoned theirs, right? Took over the homes of the wealthy, took over the homes of the royals, took over the homes of the educated, took over their lands and started to make a living. Well, 60 years later, the Babylonian army is defeated by the army of Persia. They come in and now take over everything, all of the land that Babylon had owned, including the land around Jerusalem. And King Darius I of Persia decided that the best way to create loyalty in those far-flung lands was to send captives home. And so all of the captives from all of the places that the Babylonian army that had defeated were sent home. Now, a lot of the people from Jerusalem had been living in Babylon for 60 years and decided, this is a great place. I mean, Babylon was the heart of civilization in that time. And they were there with, movie theaters, restaurants, arcades, great transit, all of the stuff that made a big city great. And they thought, now, am I going to go home to the backwater where there's nothing except work? No, I'm going to stay here, except for a faithful remnant. And that's what they're called, the faithful remnant. The faithful remnant had read and believed everything the prophet Isaiah had to say. And the prophet Isaiah talked about the day when they would be set free. And in this case, they'd be set free by what Isaiah called the Messiah. Not Jesus, but Darius. And they would be sent home to Jerusalem, and there they would rebuild the city. And through God's help, they would rebuild the temple. And Jerusalem would literally become heaven on earth. And all the people from all the worlds would see what God had done. And everyone would come flocking to Jerusalem. And that faithful remnant would be the first there to welcome them, the first rewarded by God for being that faithful. And so they went home believing everything Isaiah had said to them. And they got home to discover that, well, somebody else was living in their homes and farming their land and didn't really want to stop. So they got home and they had no place to live. They had no land upon which to grow their food. And so they looked at all of the money and materials that King Darius had sent with them to help build up the city and the temple and said, okay, well, that would be just lovely, but I think we're going to use that stuff and build homes for ourselves and buy land for ourselves. Otherwise, we're going to be homeless, we're going to be hungry, we're going to be in trouble. And the more they got to work rebuilding their lives, the harder it became to think about rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. And the harder it became to think about rebuilding the temple, because every time they thought about all the work that had to be done, every time they thought about what Solomon's temple had looked like, and it was just grand and glorious. It was the Taj Mahal of its time. It was just an amazing place. And they looked at what they had left. It didn't seem like such a good idea to get started. They were completely overwhelmed. And they were afraid that if they tried, they would fail. And they would fail God, they would fail their people, they would fail future generations, and they would fail themselves. It would be easier just to not. So Haggai came along. And on the second month of the time the people were back, on the 21st day, it happened to be the Festival of Booths, which, without any disrespect to our Jewish sisters and brothers, is kind of like our Thanksgiving. It was a time for the people to remember everything God had done for them. That God had brought all of them, who were at first immigrants and strangers in the land, to that place, and had given them homes and land, and had given them, in the midst of God's presence, a beautiful city, a city on a hill, Jerusalem, and this amazing temple where God lived in their midst. It was believed at that time that God lived in that center house, in the very center house of the temple, where the Ark of the Covenant was. And God lived in the midst of the people. And God would be their God, and they would be God's people. And that could be redone, and the people thought about that, and knew that they could never duplicate what had been. They were overwhelmed and afraid to fail, so they did nothing. And Haggai looked at them on that day of the Festival of Booths, similar to our Thanksgiving, and said, "Come on, folks. Don't you realize no matter what the house looks like, God lives in your midst? Don't you realize whatever you think you can or cannot do, that God is working with you? Don't you realize that if you do nothing, you will fail at everything? So get up, get to work, get at building the city and building the temple." And the city they built was just fine. The temple they built, compared to Solomon's, well, Solomon's temple would be this huge, wonderful cathedral somewhere, and the temple they built would be the little brick church on the corner. But it's where God lived, and it didn't matter how glorious it was, because it's where God lived. And so the people got up and got to work. On this Sunday, 2 Sundays before our Feast of Thanksgiving, I invite us to take a look at everything that needs to be done in our world, in our communities, our county, our state, our nation, our world. And think about all those problems that need to be solved, all the work that needs to be done. And how do we feel? Overwhelmed. It's easier to take care of our families. It's easier to take care of our houses. It's easier to cook the turkey and sit down and watch football than it is to think about going out and trying to solve some of the problems of the world, trying to help God make this our heaven on earth. And so we sit down with our families and eat the turkey and think how blessed we really are. And I think it's because we're afraid to fail. We're afraid to start for fear of failing. Well, Haggai says to us, take courage. Choose something in our community or our county or our state or our world that touches our souls and touches our hearts. Something that tugs at us, that we think we can't, if I only had the resources, I would take care of this. Think of that. And then go to work learning everything we can about it. Because as soon as we learn enough, God will give us the opportunity to speak. And as Sister Joan, who wrote the book that we're looking at in that class, said, the moment the silence is broken is when change begins. We don't have to solve the problem. We just have to know enough to talk about it. And if we don't have the words, God will give us the words. Now, I can see every one of you looking back at me, well, at least 75% of you looking back at me and saying, what? I don't have time for that. I've got this whole list of stuff at home. And that's true. On any given day, 75% of us will be so overwhelmed we won't be able to even think about doing anything beyond what is already on our list. But that means 25% of us will have the head space and the heart space and the time space and the ability space to do something. And on that day when we're the 25%, and we all will be at some point, you can't always say, I'm part of the 75, I'm too busy, I can't do anything, I've got to take care of just what I'm doing right now. No. At least one day out of this year, you will be among the 25% who can look and say, I've got to do something about this. And the first step is not to go out and fix it. The first step is to name it, and the second step is to learn about it. Learn about the issues. Because the day we learn enough, God will give us the opportunity to speak. And change begins when the silence is broken. I've heard you all talk. You're not afraid of it. We just need to know enough and to have the opportunity. So on one of those days when we're part of the 25%, name what it is that we're passionate about. And if not even if we're passionate about it, if on that moment and that day we say, oh, something has to change, that's our thing. And then go learn about it. God will do the rest. Haggai said, take courage, for God is in your midst. I say to all of us, take courage, because God is in our midst. As followers of Jesus Christ, part of our job is to help God build the kingdom of heaven on earth. Part of our job is to make sure that people understand who Jesus is, who God is, and what that kingdom of heaven on earth could look like. Part of our job is to speak up. Take courage. When it's time to be the 25%, get at it. Amen.
Amen.